The air smelled like burnt copper and bruised lilacs. Holden adjusted his stiff collar, expecting to endure an hour of intergalactic bureaucracy thinly veiled as a wedding. He didn't know the velvet ropes were a cage, or that all 7 brides were looking directly at him. The collar of the rented tuxedo was a saw blade against Holden's throat. It was wool blend, which was a ridiculous fabric to wear on a planet where the baseline ambient temperature hovered around 90 degrees, and the humidity felt like a wet sponge pressed over your nose. Holden hooked a finger under the bow tie and tugged, trying to let a fraction of the heavy, stagnant air touch his skin. "Stop fidgeting," Donovan muttered from beside him, not moving his lips. "You look like a teenager waiting outside the principal's office." "I feel like a rotisserie chicken," Holden shot back, keeping his voice to a strained whisper. "Who scheduled a diplomatic wedding in a greenhouse?" "It's an arboretum. Show some respect. The Vale consider this sacred ground." "I consider air conditioning a fundamental human right. But here we are." Holden shifted his weight, his dress shoes sinking slightly into the spongy moss-like carpet that covered the floor of the Valen Grand Hall. It wasn't a building in the human sense. The Vale didn't do right angles or steel beams. The entire structure was grown from the pale, calcified trunks of massive native flora, woven together into a dome of interlocking branches. Pale sunlight filtered through the translucent canopy overhead, casting sick, yellowish shadows over the assembly. The air was thick. It smelled sharp, a jarring mix of ozone, crushed wet leaves, and something metallic that always reminded Holden of old pennies left out in the rain. He was supposed to be a spectator, a glorified seat filler. Holden was a mid-level logistics officer for the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a job that usually involved screaming at supply chain managers over encrypted comms because a shipment of grain was delayed by a solar flare. When General Hayes had tapped him and Donovan to attend the ceremony of unification, Holden thought it was a punishment for messing up the requisition forms last month. Earth needed the Vale. The Vale controlled the jump gates in the Outer Rim, and Earth desperately needed a reliable supply line that didn't involve navigating a minefield of hostile pirate factions. The treaty had been signed in ink weeks ago, but the Vale required a cultural exchange, a gesture of unity, a marriage. Holden looked around at the crowd. The hall was packed with hundreds of Valen attendees. They were humanoid enough to trigger the uncanny valley response in the back of Holden's brain. They were tall, whip-thin, with skin the colour of river stones, a smooth, matte grey. They didn't wear clothes so much as they wore architectural fabric, stiff geometric folds of dark silk and woven glass that clicked softly when they moved. And they were entirely too quiet. A human wedding was a chaotic mess of whispering, crying babies, coughing and shuffling feet. The Vile sat in absolute, terrifying stillness, hundreds of them perfectly aligned in their curved wooden pews, breathing in an unconscious, synchronized rhythm, in, out, in, out. Holden felt a bead of sweat detach from his hairline and slide down his spine, pooling uncomfortably at the waistband of his trousers. He hated weddings. He had hated his own, a disastrous union with Clara 5 years ago that had started with an overpriced cake and ended with lawyers arguing over a used sedan. The concept of binding oneself to another person forever seemed biologically absurd to him now. To do it for a trade route felt even worse. "So who is the poor bastard?" Holden asked, leaning slightly toward Donovan. "The human groom. Hayes never said." "Some aristocratic diplomat from the core worlds, probably," Donovan replied, his eyes fixed on the altar. "Someone with a jawline and trust fund. Someone who looks good in a hollow broadcast. Hope they warned him about the smell." "Shut up, Holden. The delegation is coming in." Holden clamped his jaw shut. Down in the front row, the Terran delegation was seated in high-backed chairs. General Hayes was there, looking like a statue carved out of gristle and starch, his uniform crisp and covered in brass. He wasn't looking at the altar. He was looking at his lap, his jaw tight, something twisted in Holden's gut. A cold, heavy knot of anxiety that didn't make sense. It was just a weird alien wedding. He was in the third row, close enough to see the details, but far enough back to be irrelevant. Yet, The longer he stood there, the more the silence of the Valen crowd began to press against his eardrums. It wasn't just quiet, it was heavy. A physical pressure in the room. He rubbed the back of his neck. His skin felt prickly, like the static charge before a lightning strike. "Hey, Donnie," Holden whispered. "What? Do you feel that?" "Feel what?" "Like static. My teeth are vibrating." Donovan finally turned to look at him, his brow furrowed. "It's their harmonic resonance. They communicate on subaudible frequencies when they're in large groups. Turn your translator down if it's giving you a headache." Holden tapped the small silver device hooked over his right ear. The low-level hum didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. A rhythmic, thrumming vibration that matched the synchronized breathing of the crowd. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Suddenly the lighting in the canopy shifted. The yellow sunlight was eclipsed by a deep bruising violet. The synchronized breathing of the Valen crowd stopped instantly. Total silence. At the far end of the hall, the massive wooden doors groaned open. The air pressure in the room dropped, popping Holden's ears. The scent of ozone flared, burning the inside of his nostrils. "Here we go," Donovan whispered, straightening his posture. Holden swallowed dryly. He expected a bride, a single nervous alien draped in whatever passed for traditional wedding garb. Instead, 7 figures walked through the doors. They moved with a terrifying fluid grace. They didn't march, they flowed, stepping in perfect unison, their bare grey feet making absolutely no sound against the moss. They were wrapped in layers of iridescent dark fabric that seemed to absorb the violet light. Their faces were obscured by veils of spun glass, shimmering and shifting like oil slicks. But what caught Holden's attention wasn't their clothing. It was the physical weight of their presence. The moment they entered, the static charge in the air doubled. Holden's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic animal rhythm that he couldn't control. His earpiece hissed with static, then a smooth synthetic voice translated the Valen harmonic chant echoing through the hall. The hive mind split. The tether phrase, the anchor approaches. "What the hell does that mean?" Holden muttered. "Shh," Donovan hissed. The 7 brides walked slowly down the centre aisle. Holden watched them approach, his cynical detachment eroding into a raw, primal discomfort. There was something deeply unnatural about how perfectly they mirrored each other. 7 left feet lifting, 7 right feet falling. The exact same tilt of the head. It wasn't choreography. It was a single mind piloting 7 bodies. They reached the altar, arranging themselves in a crescent moon formation. A lone Valen male, at least Holden assumed it was a male based on the broader shoulders and taller stature, stepped up to the centre of the altar. He wore a simple, unadorned grey tunic. Holden sighed in relief. There was the groom, some poor Valen sap ready to tie the knot with the hive mind collective. The Valen male raised his hands. The crowd let out a low, vibrating hum that rattled the loose change in Holden's pockets. "We welcome the Terran bond," the earpiece translated. "We accept the flesh, the blood, the chaotic spark." The Valen male lowered his hands and, to Holden's absolute bewilderment, stepped down from the altar. He walked past the 7 brides, past the Terran delegation, and took a seat in the front row. The altar was empty, save for the 7 brides. Holden blinked. Wait, where's the guy? The Terran aristocrat. He looked around, scanning the front rows. There were no humans standing. General Hayes remained seated, his eyes fixed firmly forward, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The other Terran diplomats were equally still, some looking distinctly pale, others avoiding eye contact with anyone. The low hum in the room began to pitch upward, becoming a whine that made Holden's fillings ache. The 7 brides slowly turned their heads. 14 eyes, hidden behind glass veils, locked onto the right side of the room. They locked onto the 3rd row. They locked onto Holden. Holden froze. The breath died in his throat. He looked to his left, expecting to see someone standing behind him. There was only a potted indigenous fern. He looked to his right. Donovan was staring at him. "Donnie," Holden whispered, his voice cracking. Why are they looking at me?" Donovan's face was the colour of old ash. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, and took a slow, deliberate half-step away from Holden. "Donnie?" "The anchor is present. The earpiece droned. Bring forth the vessel of noise. Bring forth the stabilizing fracture." General Hayes stood up. He didn't look at the altar. He turned around and looked directly at Holden. The general's face was a mask of cold military pragmatism, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Apology. Guilt. "Mr. Holden," Hayes said. His voice wasn't amplified, but in the dead silence of the hall it carried like a gunshot. "Step forward, sir." Holden's voice was embarrassingly small. He felt a cold sweat break out across his entire body. His stomach cramped violently. I think there's a misunderstanding. I'm logistics." "There is no misunderstanding, son," Hayes said, his tone flat, leaving no room for argument. "You signed the proxy forms for the cultural exchange 3 weeks ago." Holden's mind scrambled, desperate for traction. The proxy forms, the stack of digital paperwork he had blindly thumbprinted at 2 a.m. while hopped up on synthetic caffeine, authorizing his transfer to the diplomatic escort detail. He hadn't read the addendums. Nobody read the addendums. "Those were travel waivers," Holden stammered, stepping out of the pew because his military conditioning overrode his panic. He stood in the aisle feeling violently exposed. "They were waivers for the jump gate." "They were consent forms for the tethering," Hayes corrected softly. "Step to the altar, Holden. That is a direct order. The treaty depends on it." Holden looked at Hayes, then at the 7 alien women standing on the altar, waiting for him. He felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in the back of his throat. This wasn't happening. He was an underpaid spreadsheet jockey who ate instant noodles 4 nights a week and couldn't even keep a single human marriage intact. "General, you can't be serious," Holden said, his voice rising, shedding all pretense of diplomatic decorum. "I am not marrying an alien, let alone 7 of them. I'm not a diplomat. I'm a quartermaster." "That is exactly why you were chosen," a voice echoed through the hall. It wasn't the translator earpiece. The voice came from the altar. It was a chorus of 7 voices speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. The sound was like 2 stones grinding together, heavily accented but undeniably Terran English. The bride in the centre, the tallest of the 7, reached up and pulled back her veil. Her face was strikingly angular, alien yet possessing a severe geometric beauty. Her skin was a flawless matte grey, devoid of pores or blemishes. Her eyes were solid obsidian, with no whites or irises, reflecting the violent light of the canopy above. "I am designated Beatrice," she said, her lips moving a fraction of a second behind the sound of her voice. The other 6 brides remained veiled, but Holden could feel their attention boring into his skull like a physical drill. "Beatrice," Holden said, the name tasting ridiculous in his mouth. He looked back at Hayes. "General, please, tell me this is a hazing ritual." Hayes turned his back, sitting heavily in his chair. "Do your duty for Earth, Holden. Walk up there." Holden's legs moved before his brain could stop them. His body felt heavy, flooded with adrenaline, yet sluggish, trapped in a nightmare where running was impossible. He walked down the aisle, the moss squelching faintly under his shoes. The smell of copper and ozone grew overpowering, thick enough to taste. He stopped at the base of the altar. "This is insane," Holden breathed, looking up at Beatrice. Up close, he could see the intricate network of faint, glowing blue veins running just beneath the surface of her neck. "I don't know you. You don't know me. You can't just pick a guy out of a lineup to marry a squad." "We did not pick you from a lineup, Holden," Beatrice said. The other 6 brides shifted their weight in perfect synchrony. "We analysed the psychological profiles of 3,000 Terran personnel. We required a specific architecture of the mind." "What architecture?" Holden snapped, anger finally piercing through his panic. "My credit score? My history of chronic insomnia?" Beatrice tilted her head. Her obsidian eyes seemed to swallow the light. "Your chaos." Holden stared at her. The low hum in the room returned, a physical vibration that rattled his ribs. "My chaos," he repeated, the words flat and hollow. "The veil are a unified consciousness," Beatrice explained. The 6 veiled bride stepped forward, flanking her, closing the crescent around Holden. He realized with a spike of claustrophobia that he was surrounded. We share thought, emotion, memory. For millennia it was our strength. It brought us peace. But the galaxy is loud, Holden. The jump gates, the expansion, the billions of new voices. Our network is fraying. The silence is gone. We are experiencing... What is your Terran word? "A breakdown," Hayes called out from the front row, his voice cold. "They're suffering from collective psychic degradation. Madness." "We are losing our anchor," Beatrice corrected smoothly. Though Holden saw a faint tremor in her jaw, a crack in the perfect alien facade. "If the collective shatters, our civilization burns. We will tear each other apart in the noise. We needed a stabilizing force, an anchor." Holden dragged a hand over his face, his skin slick with cold sweat. "And you think I'm an anchor? Lady, my ex-wife left me because I couldn't decide what colour to paint the kitchen for 6 months. I have mild panic attacks in crowded elevators. I am the least stable person in this room. Humanity possesses a unique cognitive resilience," Beatrice said. She took a step down, closing the distance between them. Holden's instincts screamed at him to back away, to run, but his feet felt bolted to the floor. "You live entirely alone inside your own skulls. You endure contradictions, isolation, internal conflict, and yet you function. You survive the deafening silence of a singular mind." She reached out. Her hand was long, her fingers having one too many joints. "We do not need a hero, Holden," she said, her voice dropping the chorus effect. For a brief second, she sounded like a singular entity, and it was devastatingly tired. "We do not need a perfect diplomat. We need a mind so used to static, so accustomed to internal noise and friction, that it can ground us. We need your imperfection. We need your cynical, isolated endurance." Holden looked at her hand hovering in the air. The skin looked like polished slate. He felt a sudden, profound wave of nausea. They weren't marrying him for a political alliance. They weren't using him as a figurehead. They were plugging him into their network to act as a surge protector, a psychic lightning rod to absorb the madness of an entire species. "Oh, what happens to me?" Holden asked. His voice was a rasp. He didn't look at General Hayes. He knew Hayes had written him off as collateral damage, a human sacrifice for interstellar trade routes. "When we tether, what happens inside my head?" "You will not be consumed," Beatrice said softly. The other brides murmured in an unintelligible Valen dialect, a soothing harmonic sound that made Holden's eyelids heavy. "You will remain Holden, but you will never be alone again. You will feel us, all of us. We will draw upon your emotional grit to weather the storm." "I don't want this," Holden whispered. The raw truth of it spilled out of him. It wasn't about the aliens. It wasn't about the 6 extra wives. It was the terrifying thought of someone, anyone, being inside his head. He had spent his whole life building walls, wrapping himself in sarcasm and bureaucratic monotony to keep the world at arm's length. "I know," Beatrice said. And the terrifying thing was she did know. He could feel a strange, cold pressure pressing against the base of his skull. The tethering was already beginning. "Holden!" General Hayes barked. "Sign the registry. The Veil command the gates. If you walk away from this altar, Earth loses the rim. Billions of people starve. You are a soldier." "I'm a logistician," Holden shouted back, spinning around to face the general. The sudden movement made him dizzy. "You sold me. You read my medical file. You saw I was a miserable, isolated prick, and you sold me to a hive mind to act as a filter for their insanity." Hayes didn't flinch. "Yes, I did. Because your misery is saving Earth. Now give them your hand, son." Holden stood paralyzed between the unfeeling military machine of his own species and the desperate, suffocating embrace of the Veil. The air in the Arboretum was so heavy he felt like he was drowning. He looked out at the Terran delegation. Donovan wouldn't meet his eyes. The other diplomats were staring at their shoes. He was entirely alone. "Holden," Beatrice said. He turned back to her. She hadn't moved. Her hand was still outstretched. "If I do this," Holden said, his voice trembling, the cynical armor cracking entirely, "if I let you in, you're going to see everything. The failures, the guilt, the absolute mess of it all. It's not a clean anchor, Beatrice. It's rusted and jagged." "We're drowning in a clean ocean," she replied, her obsidian eyes reflecting his pale, sweating face. "We welcome the rust." Holden stared at her hand. The Valen crowd held its breath. The silence was absolute, a crushing physical void waiting to be filled. He thought about Earth. He thought about his empty apartment, a stack of unread messages, the hollow echo of his own life. With a ragged, shuddering breath, Holden reached out and grasped Beatrice's hand. Her skin was freezing, hard like marble, yet it yielded to his grip. The moment their skin touched, a soundless explosion ripped through Holden's mind. It wasn't a sound, it was a sensation. Like falling backward into an ocean of ice water. The world around him, the Arboretum, General Hayes, Donovan, the violet light, snapped away, replaced by a blinding, terrifying white vastness. He felt a presence, not one. 7, then 70, then 700. A tsunami of consciousness crashed over him. He felt Diana's fear of the dark. He felt Chloe's grief for a lost sibling. He felt the geometric, structured rigidity of a million Valen minds trying desperately to hold on to their sanity as it fractured into a billion pieces. Noise. They were screaming in the dark, a collective hive tearing at its own seams, terrified of the vast chaotic galaxy they had plugged themselves into. Holden's knees buckled, but Beatrice's grip held him up. The physical world flickered back into view. He was on his knees on the altar, gasping for air, clutching her hand like a drowning man holding a lifeline. The 6 veiled brides had closed in, their hands resting gently on his shoulders, his back, his head. Holden. The name echoed in his mind, not spoken through his ears, but originating from the centre of his own brain. It was a chorus of a million voices, desperate, clinging, terrified. "It is too loud. The galaxy is too loud. Please!" Holden squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaved. The sheer weight of their collective panic was enough to crush a diamond. A normal mind would have shattered into 1,000 pieces, surrendering to the void. But Holden was human. He was a creature born of chaos, raised in isolation and tempered by a lifetime of quiet, enduring misery. He knew how to exist in the dark. He knew how to ignore the screaming. He gritted his teeth, the muscles in his jaw bulging and pushed back against the tide. He didn't try to soothe them. He didn't try to organize them. He just planted his feet in the psychic mud of his own stubborn, cynical identity and refused to move. Shut up, he thought, projecting the concept with all the raw, jagged frustration he had built up over 35 years of life. Just shut up and breathe. To his absolute shock, the screaming in his head hitched. It stuttered. The chaotic swirl of millions of Valen minds slammed into the dense, unyielding wall of Holden's human stubbornness. They hit the rust. They hit the jagged edges of his depression, his cynicism, his absolute refusal to break under pressure. And they anchored. The blinding white noise in his head began to dim, settling into a low, manageable hum. The frantic, terrified voices quieted, wrapping themselves around the solid, heavy pillar of his consciousness. In the physical world, the violet light in the canopy shifted back to a warm golden yellow. The collective breathing of the Valen crowd, which had been erratic and panicked for the last 10 minutes, suddenly synchronized again. In, out, in, out. Beatrice knelt in front of him. She reached out with her free hand and wiped a streak of cold sweat from Holden's cheek. The gesture was shockingly intimate, profoundly gentle. "You hold the line," she whispered, and for the first time her voice wasn't flat. It was thick with a profound, staggering relief. Holden opened his eyes. He looked at the 7 brides surrounding him. He could feel them now, not as alien strangers, but as distinct, quiet presences in the back of his mind. He felt their awe. He felt their sudden, overwhelming gratitude. He was married. To all of them. To their whole God-forsaken species. Holden let out a long, shaky breath, the absurdity of it all finally breaking through the horror. He looked past the brides, down at General Hayes, who was wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "General," Holden called out, his voice hoarse but steady. Hayes looked up. "Yes, Mr. Holden?" "When I get back to Earth," Holden said, feeling the collective curiosity of 7 brides echoing in his head, "I'm going to need a hell of a raise." The Valen wine tasted like liquid aluminum and fermented peaches. Holden swallowed it anyway, welcoming the harsh burn as it tracked down his esophagus. It was the only physical sensation sharp enough to cut through the crowded, overlapping chatter inside his own skull. The reception was held in a sprawling courtyard carved directly into the root system of the arboretum. The air here was cooler, smelling faintly of crushed limestone and damp soil. The Terran delegation stood in rigid, uncomfortable clusters near the buffet tables, holding plates of gelatinous Valen flora they clearly had no intention of eating. Holden sat at the head of a massive crescent-shaped table carved from black wood. He wasn't alone. He would never be alone again. To his left sat Beatrice. To his right, 2 more of the brides, who had mentally introduced themselves as Abigail and Victoria, or rather, they had projected the Terran approximations of their harmonic designations directly into his frontal lobe. The remaining 4 stood perfectly still behind his chair, like a Secret Service detail spun out of silk and obsidian. The fluid is a neuroinhibitor. It damages your liver function. The thought wasn't his. It blossomed in his mind like a drop of ink in water, accompanied by a phantom sensation of mild concern. It felt like Victoria. "My liver is the least of my problems right now," Holden muttered aloud, setting the crystalline goblet down on the table. Beatrice turned her head. Her glass veil was still pushed back, revealing those bottomless, light-swallowing eyes. "You speak aloud. It is unnecessary. We hear the surface ripples of your mind." "I know you do," Holden thought, deliberately projecting a sense of profound irritation. "But I am human. I move my mouth. It makes me feel like I'm still in the driver's seat. Give me this." A wave of acquiescence washed over him. It was a bizarre physical sensation, like a warm breeze blowing through the inside of his ribcage. They were adapting to him. The terrifying, crushing weight of the hive mind had receded, funneling itself through the 7 brides before it reached him. They were the buffer. He was the anchor. "Holden?" General Hayes approached the table, flanked by Donovan. Hayes had shed his dress jacket, though his posture remained as rigid as a steel girder. Donovan looked like he was suffering from acute seasickness, his eyes darting nervously between the 7 towering Valen women and Holden. "General," Holden said flatly. He didn't stand up. The sheer physical exhaustion of processing 8 consciousnesses at once made his limbs feel like wet sand. "The perimeter is secured, and the jump gate control codes have been transferred to our flagship," Hayes said, keeping his voice low. He glanced at Beatrice, then back to Holden. "You did well, son. Earth owes you a debt." Holden let out a short, humorless laugh. Inside his head, 7 distinct points of curiosity flared, analysing the acoustic properties of his laughter and the bitter emotional resonance attached to it. "Don't play the proud father, Hayes," Holden said, leaning back in his chair. 3 hours ago you threw me to the wolves because I didn't read the fine print on a travel waiver. You didn't know if I was going to survive that tethering. I knew you were a logistical operations manager who spent 5 years untangling the Mars colony supply chain without having a nervous breakdown, Hayes countered coolly. You have a high tolerance for systemic chaos. That was exactly what the veil required. He lies, a voice echoed in Holden's mind. It was Abigail. His heart rate elevates. His sweat production increases. He acted on desperate probability, not certainty. Holden stared at the general, feeling a slow, cynical smile spread across his face. You know the funny thing about being tethered to a telepathic hive mind, General? I don't need a polygraph anymore. They can smell the adrenaline on your skin. They can read the microtremors in your jaw. Hayes froze. Donovan took a half step backward, looking terrified. So let's skip the patriotic speeches, Holden continued, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. You got your jump gates. Earth gets its trade routes, but I am the anchor now. If I break, this entire planet's psychic network shatters, and they close those gates forever. That makes me the most critical piece of infrastructure in the Outer Rim. Hayes's jaw tightened. What are your demands, Holden? First, I want a permanent staff position with a Class A diplomatic salary, backdated to the start of this fiscal year, Holden said, ticking the items off on his fingers. Second, I want my own shuttle. Third, I want Donovan transferred to my personal staff to handle my requisition forms. He owes me for making me wear this god-awful tuxedo. Donovan blinked, utterly bewildered. Wait, what? Done, Hayes said without a second of hesitation. The general gave a sharp, curt nod. You'll have the paperwork by tomorrow morning. Take care of your wives, Holden. Hayes turned on his heel and marched away. Donovan lingered for a second, gave Holden a weak apologetic salute, and scurried after the general. Holden exhaled, slumping slightly in his chair. The collar of the tuxedo was still choking him, and the humidity was still awful, but a tiny ember of satisfaction glowed in his chest. You wield authority through coercion, Beatrice observed softly. It is a crude mechanism. Yet it brings you a sense of internal stabilization. Fascinating. Welcome to humanity, Beatrice, Holden sighed, rubbing his temples. We run entirely on spite and caffeine. The honeymoon didn't last. In fact, it barely started before the crisis hit. It happened 3 days later, inside the central command spire of the Valen capital. Holden had traded the rented tuxedo for a loose, grey linen tunic that closely resembled the Valen architecture. He was sitting in a circular chamber, attempting to teach Victoria and Abigail the concept of a crossword puzzle, when the air pressure in the room vanished. Holden's ears popped violently. A split second later, a soundless shriek tore through his skull. He dropped his pen, clutching his head with both hands. It felt as if a white-hot railroad spike had been driven directly behind his eyes. Around him, the 7 brides collapsed to their knees in perfect unison, their hands clawing at their temples, their spun glass veils shivering. Noise. Too much noise. The rift tears. The voices in his head weren't whispers anymore. They were a deafening, hysterical chorus of millions. Holden gasped, falling out of his chair. His knees hit the smooth glass floor. Beatrice, what is it? What's happening? Beatrice was beside him, her obsidian eyes wide, the glowing blue veins in her neck throbbing with dangerous intensity. The Terran fleet, she projected, the thought fractured and bleeding with panic. They are activating the primary jump gate, the energy displacement, the billions of new minds entering our sector. The collective cannot process the sensory influx. The network is fragmenting. Holden looked out the spire's massive window. In the pale yellow sky, a massive tear in reality was forming, a jagged, bleeding scar of purple and black energy. The Terran dreadnoughts were coming through, bringing with them the psychic static of hundreds of thousands of human sailors, soldiers and engineers. To the telepathic veil, it was like someone had dropped a flashbang inside a library. The brides began to keen, a high-pitched physical wail of agony that mirrored the psychic screaming in Holden's mind. The entire planet was going into shock. The synchronization was failing. If it shattered, millions of Veil would be trapped in permanent violent psychosis. Holden, Beatrice pleaded, her cold hand gripping his wrist with bruising force. Anchor us! Pull us down! I don't know how! Holden shouted over the physical and mental noise. There's too much! I'm just one guy! Use your chaos, Abigail projected, her mental voice faint, drowning in the tide of the collective panic. Show us how you survive the noise. Holden squeezed his eyes shut, His heart hammered furiously. The sheer volume of the panic was threatening to rip his own consciousness apart. He needed a shield. He needed something so dense, so emotionally impenetrable, that the psychic storm would break against it. He didn't think of love. He didn't think of peace or tranquility, or any of the serene nonsense the Veil usually relied upon. Holden thought of the Department of Motor Vehicles in Neo-Chicago. He dragged the memory up from the depths of his mind. He visualized the flickering, jaundiced fluorescent lights. He recalled the smell of stale floor wax and cheap coffee. He focused entirely on the crushing, absolute boredom of holding ticket number 482 when the digital sign was stuck on 115. He projected the feeling of waiting, the dull, cynical ache of knowing you are trapped in a bureaucratic purgatory, and that no amount of screaming or crying will make the line move faster. You just have to sit there. You have to endure. What is this? Beatrice's thought was confused, struggling against the memory. This is a Tuesday, Holden projected back, pushing the memory outward with all his strength. This is human existence. It's loud, it's annoying, and it doesn't care about you. Stop fighting it. Just sit down and wait for your number to be called. He piled on more memories, the numb exhaustion of a 12-hour shift staring at spreadsheets, the dull disappointment of a microwave dinner that was still frozen in the middle, the grim, stubborn acceptance of walking 3 miles in the freezing rain because the mag train broke down. He fed the hive mind the pure, unadulterated essence of human grit, the profound ability to exist in deeply uncomfortable, chaotic situations and simply shrug it off. The effect was instantaneous. The Valen Collective slammed into the mental construct of Holden's apathy, like a tidal wave hitting a concrete breakwater. The sheer, suffocating boredom of his memories acted as a psychic dampener. The panic couldn't survive in the face of such aggressive, cynical mundanity. Inside his head, the hysterical screaming began to muffle, as if someone had thrown a heavy wool blanket over a siren. In, out, in, out. The synchronized breathing returned. Holden opened his eyes, his chest heaving as he sucked in greedy lungfuls of air. The pain behind his eyes rapidly faded to a dull, throbbing ache. Outside the window, the purple tear in the sky stabilized into a smooth, glowing ring. The massive, brutalist silhouettes of the Terran fleet glided through the jump gate in perfect formation. The physical noise was immense, but the psychic storm had been broken. Around him, the 7 brides slowly stood up. They were trembling, their grey skin paler than usual, but their eyes were clear. Beatrice knelt next to Holden. She didn't speak, nor did she project a thought. Instead, she did something profoundly physical, profoundly unalien. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. A moment later, Abigail rested her hand on his back. Victoria touched his knee. The others gathered around, a silent, comforting circle of cool skin and heavy silk. Through the tether, Holden felt their collective emotion. It wasn't awe this time. It was a deep, resonating comfort, a profound sense of safety. They had looked into the absolute worst, most chaotic parts of the human experience and found a fortress of endurance. Holden let his head drop back against the glass wall. He looked at the alien women surrounding him, feeling the quiet, steady hum of their minds interwoven with his own. He was exhausted. His back hurt. He missed cheap beer and terrible reality television. But as he felt Beatrice's slow, steady breathing against his collarbone, the cynical shell that had protected him for 35 years cracked just a fraction more. He wasn't just a logistics officer anymore. He was the load-bearing pillar for an entire civilization. "All right," Holden muttered, gently patting Beatrice's shoulder. "That's enough excitement for one day. Let's go finish that crossword puzzle." Did Holden's cynical survival resonate with you? Sometimes, the greatest superpower humanity has isn't our strength, but our stubborn ability to endure the chaos. If you love this deep dive into human endurance and the sheer absurdity of alien bureaucracy, hit that like button and share it with a fellow sci-fi fan. Subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our weekly HFY stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments.